Today, we'll also see the agreement of the new Security and Defence Partnership, which will pave the way for the UK defence industry to participate in the EU's proposed new 150 billion Security Action for Europe, acronym SAFE, defence fund, supporting thousands of British jobs and boosting growth. So, in a joint enough context, the arms trade is not an immediately kind of obvious choice for a talk, but that statement, I think, makes the links clear between national prosperity, what the government sees as economic growth, but we know to be unsustainable, and the arms trade. So this is a very relevant and appropriate subject for this evening. And so we're very grateful that Amy Hall is here from the New Internationalist to talk about this issue. So over to you, Amy.
Thank you, and it's really nice to see you all here today. As John said, my name is Amy and I'm a co-editor at New Internationalist. And we're talking about the arms trade today. It's not the most cheery topic, but hopefully I can provide some hope as well. It's going to start off with talking about, I guess, some of the realities of what's happening in the world. So more than half of Sudan's population, so that's around 24.6 million people, are now facing acute hunger thanks to the war, which began in April 2023. And the country is now experiencing what has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And then in Gaza, which we've seen in the news a lot over the last couple of weeks, humanitarian groups are struggling to get aid in. And just last night, 45 people were killed in airstrikes, and I think it's been much more even just today. Meanwhile, the export licensing figures show that there was a massive increase in UK arms sales to Israel between October and December 2024, which was more in that 3-month period than between 2020 and 2023, 3 years combined. And the arms trade fuels this chaos, profiting from the fear and suffering while communities are left devastated. But building on a long legacy of peace activism and campaigning against the arms trade, there is a growing movement taking action to dismantle the machinery of war that profits at the expense of humanity. And before I go on to speak a bit more about the arms trade, I just also wanted to say a little bit about New Internationalist. So we're an independent, cooperatively run media organisation owned by our workers and over 4,600 readers across the world. And we specialise in in-depth reporting and analysis that you won't find in the mainstream media. And alongside our global network of writers, we publish a magazine every 2 months, which covers a range of social and environmental justice stories. We have a fortnightly podcast called The World Unspun, and also a bi-weekly newsletter called Currents, as well as publishing a range of articles on our website. And at the beginning of this year, we published a magazine focused on the arms trade, what it looks like. And it covered all sorts of stories from India to Sudan to Ireland, reporting on how the network's fueling conflict and how people are taking on some of the world's most powerful companies and governments and winning. And then we launched a series called How to Stop the Arms Trade, which focuses on how we can hold our governments and institutions to account for their complicity in the arms trade. And through the series, we're exploring questions such as, why do our leaders continue to funnel money into this industry? And how can we build stronger links across borders to challenge the weapons industry? And the next piece that we have coming up in the series is about Yemen and how the UK went from selling bombs to be used there to be dropped on the country directly. And we've got much more coming up over the next year. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the kind of scale, I guess, of what we're talking about. So while the world's 100 biggest arms companies brought in $597 billion in revenue in 2022, thanks to demand linked to what's been happening in Gaza and also Ukraine, revenues from the sales of arms and military services by the 100 largest arms companies grew to $632 billion in 2023. And we're yet to see the same figures for 2024, but it seems like they will also be growing again. And the US really dominates the industry. So 9 of the world's biggest arms companies are from the US. which also gives the US a lot of muscles to flex on the geopolitical stage. But it is really a global industry. The 15 largest companies have a presence in at least 49 different countries. So that's why you'll kind of see, I don't know, protests against, for example, Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli arms company in the UK, or L3Harris, which is a US company. And arms are always flowing between countries. So again, the US is by far the world's biggest exporter of arms, and they have 43% of the global share of arms exports, followed by France with 9.6%. So there's quite a big difference, sorry. And the UK is the 7th biggest exporter. So we're still pretty big players, I guess, on like a global scale. And then in terms of arms coming in, the Ukraine has now become the world's biggest importer of arms, with 8.8% of global share, followed by India and Qatar and Saudi Arabia. And the arms trade is a little bit like an iceberg. So there's what's happening kind of above the surface. So the impacts of war, the big deals. And then there's so much happening underneath, which is really hard to find out about. And companies are often kind of unwilling or unable to trace what happens to their products. And governments aren't always honest about what they're buying and selling or the identity of the parties involved. It's been estimated that 40% of all corruption cases in international trade are linked to arms deals. And the UK government claims to be a leader in transparency in arms exports, but researchers have pointed to the significant gaps in available information, particularly when it comes to the use of open licenses. And these licenses give permission for unlimited exports of specified equipment to the destination countries covered by the license over a long period of time. And they don't have any financial value or quantities attached. So that means that when they're published, the values for UK arms exports only give a kind of partial picture of the trade. And it also makes it easier for our government to send arms to kind of repressive regimes, places the public might not be that happy about, whilst also kind of being able to give a kind of illusion of restraint. Campaign Against Arms Trade, or CAT, as they're also known, have done quite a lot of work to try and expose this. And their research suggests that a majority of the arms exports licensed by the UK government are supplied via these open licenses. And while the US may dominate, the UK still has a significant role to play. I recently went to a protest in London where I spoke to somebody called Janine from the Palestinian Youth Movement. And the way she put it was that here in Britain, we're strategically located within the imperial core, jam the gears of empire. So we really have an important role to play in disrupting capital or disrupting the flow of capital. The sixth biggest arms company in the world is BAE Systems, which is a British company. And the UK is also a significant exporter and importer of arms, as we mentioned earlier. Our biggest customers are Qatar, who take 28% of our exports, and they're also one of the countries linked to the flow of arms into Sudan. The US is number 2, and then Ukraine. And our biggest providers of arms, so that's like who we buy the most from, is by far the US with 86%, followed by Israel and Spain. And arms companies are also kept very close to power in the UK. So the government has an entire arms sales unit dedicated to promoting weapons purchase, and it also provides insurance for companies making arms deals. And CAT and the World Peace Foundation have described how the lines between the arms industry and the British government have been virtually erased in recent years, with company representatives getting an unprecedented level of access to the highest levels of government. Between 2012 and 2023, BAE Systems had more meetings with government ministers than any other private company. And as we've seen kind of more recently, Britain is ramping up its military spending, which is following kind of a global trend. which is also kind of a victory for the arms companies. An investigation for the National in Scotland found that the arms dealers lobbied ministers 19 times in just 2 months after Labour came to power. And our MPs have been also attempting to rebrand arms companies as ethical investments. Earlier this year, more than 100 Labour MPs and peers signed an open letter calling for British banks and fund managers to turn on the financial taps and stop viewing all defence investments as unethical. It argued that environmental, social and governance investment requirements, or ESG as they're called, should be removed for some of these companies, which could pave the way for more of our pensions or other places where we put money to be invested in arms companies in a way that they weren't before. And it's also worth noting that before the last general election, nearly 1 in 10 Labour MPs received financial support from Arden Strategies, which is a lobbying firm that represented arms companies and oil giants, and is founded by Jim Murphy, who's a former Labour cabinet minister. And these kind of relationships have also had an impact on how people taking action to confront the arms trade are treated. We've seen that kind of in more recent years with activism linked to Palestine. In 2020, Israel's then Ministers for Strategic Affairs reportedly met with the UK Defence Secretary, Dominic Raab at the time, to discuss Palestine solidarity activism, including direct action against Elbit Systems, which is an Israeli arms company. And also Israeli embassy officials have been reportedly trying to influence protests related to court cases in the UK. In May 2024, a report by the UK government advisor on political violence and extremism, John Woodcock, who's now Lord Warney, suggested that groups like Palestine Action and also Just Stop Oil could be banned in a similar way to terrorist organisations. And this Lord Warney has also been found to be a lobbyist for the arms and fossil fuel industries. And also recently we've seen this in the last few weeks with how the Crown Prosecution Service has alleged terrorism connection to 2 groups of Palestine Action activists, the Instro 10 and the Filton 18, in otherwise ordinary criminal cases. So they haven't been charged with terrorism offences, but it means that when they're sentencing, those things could be brought into to their sentencing. So why is the state so keen to protect arms companies? One of the arguments that's often given is the economy, which John was talking about earlier. But any contribution this does make has to be weighed against what it costs us. So Commonwealth has documented how the arms industry is governed by a different set of rules than the rest of the UK economy, being exempt from several trade treaties, including the WTO's Agreement on Public Procurement. And the industry also receives significant and often preferential state intervention, including funding for research and development, which is predominantly paid for by the state and by export customers, sorry. So between 1987 and 2009, defence production on average received 35% of UK's public research and development funding. And according to Campaign Against Arms Trade, support for arms sales alone costs taxpayers £100 million a year. Still, the Chancellor, the Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, has pledged to put defence at the heart of industrial strategy. And one argument for this is the jobs that might be created. But arms only account for around 0.2% of UK jobs and around 1.1 to 2% of exported goods. But as Kat have noted, all government spending creates jobs. So spending on healthcare, education, green energy production, that would also create jobs as well. So our governments are making a political choice about which jobs it wants to create. And there's also been research, not so much in the UK, but in other countries around the world about job creation and comparing different sectors. There was a study by Greenpeace Europe, which looked at the economic impact of spending €1 billion on arms procurement, the environmental sector, health or education. And they looked at Germany, Italy and Spain. and they found that spending on environmental industries produced the greatest gains in economic output in terms of jobs. The 1 billion euros invested in arms produced 6,150 jobs in Germany compared to 11,360 through the same amount of money being invested in the environment. And another reason, I guess, that's also given for support of the arms trade is security and safety. Last week, I was at the High Court in London as the government tried to defend its decisions over arms sales to Israel, and that was like one of their main central arguments. They were saying that they need to continue supplying components for the global F-35 program, of which Israel is a customer, in order to protect national and international peace and security. And Israel has been using F-35s in Gaza over the last 18 months. But I would argue that the arms trade basically keeps itself and its backers safe, and it's certainly not keeping people who are suffering the impacts of war safe. There's also the threat of Russia and kind of other places that has been used to ramp up military spending across Europe. But as Katie Fallon of CAP pointed out in an event that we ran recently in London, taking the US out of the equation, Europe is far more armed together than Russia is as a whole. And here, the government is ramping up military spending at the same time as cutting the aid budget and slashing £5 billion from disability benefits. The government, according to the government's own estimations, its cuts to welfare will drive 250,000 people in the UK into poverty. So I would argue that that is not keeping people here safe either. And there was a nice quote about this kind of issue of safety by researcher Vijay Prashad, who's kind of someone who's done quite a lot of work on the arms industry. And I spoke to him for a magazine about the arms trade. And he said, you can do security in two different ways. You can build a giant gate around your house. You can dig moats. You can fill it with alligators. You can have sharpshooters sitting there on duty on the roof to keep yourself protected from criminals. Or you could create a social welfare society where people don't feel desperate enough to break into your house or to rob things. And there are two ways to do security, and I prefer the second. I don't want to live with crocodiles in a moat around my house. I would prefer a society of care rather than a society of caution. And he was using that kind of analogy when talking about how he thinks that on a global scale, there's been a decline in diplomacy and a kind of prioritization of war. And there is also another threat to our safety that the arms industry is cashing in on, and that's something that we go into in the magazine, and that's the threats of climate change and environmental damage. So arms companies and governments are keen to argue that military power is essential for security in a changing climate, but they're contributing massively to that climate changing. Militaries are some of the biggest energy and resource users, making up for around 5.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And in 2020, the UK military industrial sector alone emitted 6.5 million tonnes of CO2, more than 60 countries combined. But tracking military emissions is quite hard because countries don't necessarily have to report on them. And then with military spending on the rise, especially for new technology, we can expect emissions to climb even higher. There were some kind of stats around recent wars around the kind of environmental toll. So the carbon emissions from just the first 120 days of Israel's assault on Gaza were higher than the annual emissions of 26 countries. And the emissions from 2 years of the Russia-Ukraine war exceeded those of 175 countries. So yeah, wars not only harm the environment, but also have a massive impact on kind of the human cost as well. And then also kind of forcing, they can also destroy renewable energy infrastructure, forcing countries to shift resources towards humanitarian efforts and rebuilding. And yet the military is still trying to rebrand itself as eco-friendly with initiatives like solar-powered drones and even the idea of seed-sprouting bullets. Military leaders around the world are positioning themselves as climate warriors, claiming that the military can lead the fight against climate change. Meanwhile, arms company stocks are at an all-time high, and the major financial shareholders with economic stakes in mining, fossil fuels, and arms companies are often the same, connected via fund management companies who seem to kind of own the world. The top three investors in the arms industry, BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, together hold an average 16% of shares in major arms companies operating in the UK. BlackRock and Capital Group together control more than a quarter of BAE Systems, for example. And with over 61,000 Palestinians now killed in Gaza, campaigners are calling for a people's arms embargo against Israel, or what's been called an arms embargo from below, focused on disrupting the production, transportation, licensing, and selling of arms in any way possible. And as I mentioned earlier, the title of our series is How to Stop the Arms Trade. And the good news is that while it may seem like a massive, secretive industry, there are so many things that we can do to challenge the power of the arms trade at every level and across different points of the supply chain. So, as I mentioned last week, I was in London for the court case against the government. And thanks to public pressure in September last year, the UK government suspended a number of licenses for arms exports to Israel. But they created a loophole which allowed them to continue to indirectly export parts for F-35 fighter jets. And this is despite the government's own admission that Israel is not committed to complying with international humanitarian law. Last week's hearing, which challenged this loophole, was led by Palestinian human rights organisation Al-Haq, represented by the Global Legal Action Network. And they argued that the UK has a duty to prevent genocide and stop the sale of weapons to any state committing violations of international humanitarian law. And there's a number of other similar cases which have been happening around F-35s and arms to Israel in other countries who are part of the programme. And as well as supporting cases in the courts, it's also possible to target arms companies directly. People have taken direct action, protests, petitions, and other forms of local campaigning. Here in Brighton, which is on the south coast, we have an arms factory called L3Harris, which is like tucked away on this industrial estate on the edge of the city. And they manufacture bomb release mechanisms which are used in F-35 fighter jets, and also components made at this factory have also been used in Yemen and documented and used in other countries. People have done all sorts of things, from blockades, they've held protests outside, put pressure on the local council over the company's planning permission, and also done a lot of work to kind of raise awareness about the factory in the city. And recently, they after some public pressure, a local metal plating company cut its ties with L3Harris, saying that they were no longer going to work with them. And we've also seen dock workers across the world refusing to load or unload weapons that are on their way to places like Yemen and Gaza. So kind of taking action where they are. And the industry is also propped up by like an international network of banks and research institutes and other intermediaries that facilitate weapons transfers. So this week we saw that King's College Cambridge had divested from arms companies. Previously, they had investments of around nearly $3 million in arms companies, including Lockheed Martin and BAE Systems. And now they've said that they're going to divest from these companies. And then there's also a campaign called Boycott Bloody Insurance, which is launched to expose insurers' complicity in border militarization, fossil fuels, and military equipment. And again, that's something that a lot of people can get involved in because insurance is something that we all often use. And not only do insurance kind of underwrite the risks for defence companies, but they also invest millions of dollars in the sector, which enables them to expand and drive up profits. The campaign has revealed investments of over $1.77 billion from a range of multinational insurers into companies supplying military equipment used by Israel in Gaza. One of the companies that is the focus of this campaign is AIG, which insures Maersk, which is like a Danish international logistics company, providing logistical and shipping support for the Israeli military. And at New Internationalist, one of our overall focus is the global economic system that has been set up to perpetuate economic injustice and climate collapse. And the arms industry is an important tool in maintaining the system. Instead of keeping ordinary people safe, it's keeping power and capital safe by maintaining inequality. But there are so many people challenging that across the world and challenging the narrative that equates security with weapons and violence. And we can advocate for peace and challenge an industry that actively works against it. That's it from me for now. Sorry about the brief interruption.
And thank you, Amy, and sorry that you've got a bit of a cough, but we're really grateful for you for your setting out the whole situation so clearly and succinctly. Kat's, I think, or somebody's got one question on the chat. There may be other people who want to raise their hands, but could I just put a question to you first? I'm just wondering how we got to this situation. I don't know if you have any views on that. I mean, is this something, an outcome of kind of turbocharged global capitalism getting underway in the 80s? I mean, what was there this significant amount of arms trade, exports, imports, let's say in the 1930s? Exactly where has this come from? Do you have any views on that?
So I don't know the answer to the last part of your question, in terms of like how things have changed. I know that things have become a lot more kind of consolidated, and as I was talking about earlier, how the US dominates so much the industry, and is like the world's biggest military spender. And I think kind of that is kind of part of the story, and I guess just kind of the strength of like how the industry has managed to get close to power and that kind of thing. So it's probably a combination of things, but I think the kind of consolidation of arms production is part of it.
Yeah. There's a Green Christian hand up and also a comment from Green Christian. So I don't know if that's you, Kat, or Barbara.
That's me.
Yeah.
But if I may, I'm going to ask a different question, actually.
Okay.
Is that all right? It's cheap. We'll save the other one in case we have time.
Yeah.
I'm just really struck, Amy, by the fact that I've rarely seen globally governments be so disconnected from the will of the people. So we have people turning out in their hundreds of thousands to protest Gaza, to protest all sorts of things, and yet it's as though they've stopped caring what people think until the next election, I guess. Plus this authoritarian trend of imprisoning people for peaceful protest, which has got to have a chilling effect. I don't know whether you've any thoughts on that. I'm just myself, it just feels really dystopian that there is this massive disconnect between supposed public servants and the people they're meant to serve.
Yeah, totally. And again, it's not just the UK, it's like so many countries where that is the case. I think like, yeah, I guess there's a couple of things. I mean, the kind of clampdown on activism is something that's not just affecting arms trade activists, obviously climate change activists and others as well, and has been partly driven by industry lobbying from different industries, but also I guess we have seen this happen on other issues. Again, I'm thinking about climate change, where you've seen like so many people out. But yeah, I do think like this isn't just a thing with the UK. I guess it's partly also a geopolitical issue to do with where power lies in the world and what and who our governments are prepared to challenge, and what they feel the consequences of that might be. I wonder how things are going to change in the coming weeks. I mean, we've already seen kind of our government kind of changing its tune slightly in the last few days, even though it's obviously continuing to supply arms in the background. So I do wonder how things will change. But yeah, I think ultimately the clampdown on activism and also kind of what our governments are doing aren't, again, to protect people. It's around protecting the interests of these companies, but also, yeah, maintaining geopolitical power.
Thank you. Mark, you were next.
Yes, Amy, I don't know whether you'll be able to answer this question or not, but I was interested in it. I think Costa Rica is one country that's done away with its military completely. So I wonder. Well, the first thing is to wonder have they had any adverse consequences from that? I don't know. Maybe you can comment on that. But the other thing I was interested in was that I stumbled across a new website yesterday by a chap called Thomas Crowther, who is basically an ecologist who's really interested in biodiversity. And he set up this global website covering all the countries in the world with how many regenerative ecological projects they have, and and you can zoom in using his Google Earth type stuff to see how many are in each country and what they actually are. And I just out of interest, Northern Ireland has got 6 or now 7 because I added one yesterday. But the UK has only got 1,000 or just over 1,000, and Costa Rica has got 2,500 for such a small country. I wonder, are those two things related? Their increase in putting money into ecological restoration and climate change prevention, and the fact that they've done away with the military.
Yeah, I mean, possibly the example of Costa Rica, actually, we did in the magazine, we have a what if column, and it's kind of like, what if we did X, Y, and Z? And Simon Hill, who's well-known peace activist, he wrote about what if armed forces were abolished, and he kind of referenced Costa Rica, and that I'll share a link in the chat. I mean, yeah, obviously threats. There are like various different threats to different countries from other countries. I guess it's about like how we perceive those threats and like realistically evaluating them. And yeah, Simon talks a bit about that in the article, and kind of this idea of whether you could abolish armies or not. But yeah, it's interesting what you say about the connection with what they're doing environmentally. I guess it's part of like an overall program, and like I was saying earlier about governments making choices about where they spend their money.
Thank you. Barbara.
Right. Okay. Would I be right in thinking that you said Qatar was the country that we are exporting the largest proportion of our arms exports to? Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I hadn't heard that, and it just struck me as.
Oh no, sorry. Let me just correct myself. Let me just double check. Yes, no, that is correct. Yeah.
Oh gosh. Right.
There's these are quite recent figures. Yeah.
They are supposedly the peace brokers, but importing all of our weapons. Right. Yeah. Secondly, just a statement. It's been reassuring over the last some years, decades, that European countries, perhaps with the exception of ourselves and France, have been reducing their amounts of money they're spending on arms. And now, of course, with the Ukraine situation, that's all changed, which is terribly tragic and sad. But really, my question is, though, do you make distinctions between offensive weapons and defensive weapons? In other words, would there be an honourable case for making that we should manufacture and export defensive weapons, but not export any offensive weapons? Or do you not really see that as an important distinction?
I think in terms of the kind of like stats and stuff that I've been talking about, I'm not sure that they make distinctions. I guess, yeah, for me,
if
it's
somebody like Putin walks into your country like he has in Ukraine, you know, you're going to want something to stop him taking over the entire country, aren't you? And yet we don't want to be exporting arms to countries that are going to be indeed doing what Putin is doing and attacking other countries.
So yeah, I guess like for me, it's kind of partly around like proportionality and what, again, this thing about threats and like how we perceive them and what are kind of like realistic threats, and also like whether or not how far diplomacy has gone. And I think that it's not always as it's complicated, right? And like all of these things are quite complicated. But there's been quite a move away from diplomacy globally. And had we not been doing that, maybe we would be seeing less of these kinds of wars.
Yeah.
Before Catherine Fish asks questions, a chat question from Rod, and Rod asks, are funds with an ethical label free of investments in the arms trade? Can we be confident of where our savings are going? So I don't know if you...
I mean, yeah, I think at the moment they are generally, people these kinds of funds try and steer very clear of the arms trade. And I think basically that was what these MPs are trying to change, was that would potentially change in the future. But yeah, I think generally, I mean, it would depend. You'd have to look into the details, but generally people don't, arms companies are one of the things, like also tobacco companies, that they tend to steer quite clear of when they're using that label.
Right.
I also saw the comment or question about preventing further attacks on the basis of ecocide. I don't actually know. I guess we'd have to check in with some lawyers on that, but it is an interesting question, which I'm kind of tempted to ask the Global Legal Action Network about after this.
Catherine, you have a question.
Thank you, Amy. It's very informative. Going back to the F-35 loophole case that Al-Haq have brought, isn't there also, as well as an element that Kat talked about, of disconnect between the people and the government, there is a real element of secrecy, isn't there? Shrouded clandestinity, and how do we not know that there's a lot more of this clandestine working going on, and who can uncover it?
Yeah, I mean, the last part of the hearing last week was closed, so I wasn't able to hear some of what they were talking about. And there was a lot of frustration from the lawyers involved about how many of the documents had been redacted or not been released in relation to the case. I mean, I think just, you know, investigative journalists and independent journalists and also researchers and lawyers are doing a lot of work to try and uncover all these different things. But yeah, there is a lot of a lack of transparency. And that has to do with lots of different things, including the licenses that I was talking about earlier. But yeah, it was very frustrating being in court and kind of hearing what the government was saying. And it wasn't only a disconnect between the public and the government, but also like the government and the government. So like it would be on one hand saying, you know, we recognise that Israel isn't committed to complying with international humanitarian law, but we don't think that the risk is we don't think the risk of, for example, genocide is high enough at this point. Or but we can see that all of these things are happening, but we're not going to do anything until someone else says there's a genocide. Yeah, so there was a lot of like kind of contradictions, and also in the issue of national security. They were kind of saying that the F-35 program was obviously so important to national and international security. If we disrupt it, we're going to upset the US, we're going to upset NATO, we're going to, you know, be at risk. And yet, on the other hand, they were saying that, well, even if we don't export to the F-35 program, then it's not going to make much difference to Israel anyway, because like they've got all of this military might. So if their F-35s make so much difference to us and to other countries, then why don't they make so much a difference to Israel? So there was quite a lot of these kinds of different issues that were coming up throughout the
Amy,
court
do you
case.
think that this Al-Haq court case was instrumental in the government in the last 24 hours suspending talks on arms sales? Do you think?
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I don't know what's happening with the judgment. We should hear that soon, so I don't know
Yeah.
what's happening behind the scenes. Possibly, I think also just the headlines around the situation and the aid blockade and all of that. I think, and the massive protest, obviously, that happened at the weekend. Probably a combination.
Just thinking about divestment and the kind of pressure that we can, as individuals, can bring to bear on different organizations. Obviously, there are organizations like BlackRock investing in the arms industry that are not going to be susceptible to very easily to kind of mass protests or public pressure. But are there kind of pressure points that are worth, in your view, pushing at, which we're not doing sufficiently at present?
I think there's so much happening, so I'm not sure if it's not being done sufficiently, but there's totally so many different pressure points along the supply chain. And I think that those like small actions together is what can make a real difference. I mean, this is a kind of slightly older example, but in the magazine I interviewed a couple of activists from Derry in Northern Ireland about their campaign to shut down the Raytheon factory there. And that obviously not just shut down Raytheon and Derry, but it also had like a big impact on how Raytheon kind of perceived, how communities felt about it, had an impact on arms trade activism in other places. But yeah, I just think that there are so many, one of the things about it being such a massive industry with its ties in so many places is that there are so many places where people can take action. And Workers for Palestine have done quite a lot of work on like, what people can do in their workplaces. We've just talked about like insurance companies and all of that. So I think there are just anywhere, basically, just on the high street, anywhere, there's always things. CAT have done quite a good like map around like places where there's F-35 components being produced or like other things happening. So that's quite an interesting resource. But yeah, I just think there are so many points along the supply chain, and thinking about the supply chain is important. So like here in Brighton, that's what they've been doing, is kind of thinking about, okay, who's delivering to L3Harris and like where are all the connections?
There's a hand up with Green Christian, which might be historical or...
Nope, it's me.
Right. Is there a question you wanted to ask?
There is, if that's okay, unless anybody else needs to go first. So,
no, I think the floor is open.
Great, thank you, Amy. Just so there's a comment as well as a question, and my comment under the ecocide thing is I'm just scouting around under the it's Article 31(1) of the Responsibility of States for Internationally Wrongful Acts. That's the International Law Commission 2001. That apparently makes Israel, for example, responsible for full reparation, even if ecocide is not a crime in that country. So I'm just wondering whether that's an avenue. And I'm wondering as well whether when you're in the middle of a war or a genocide, you're probably not counting your carbon emissions too closely. But when you're exporting those emissions by exporting ordnance, so most countries' defense forces don't have to report their greenhouse gases because it might compromise their national security. So the only figures that we've got for the arms trade and the military are estimates based on what we know, and that's likely to be a huge underestimate and exclude things like military infrastructure, like the roads Israel's building for its incursions. And I'm wondering whether there is an avenue to go after governments such as ours for breaches of our climate commitments on the basis that we are exporting ordnance that's going to cause climate change, but it's not our war, so we can't hide behind national security. I don't know whether that's feasible or not, but it might be inconsistent with our obligations under the Climate Change Act.
Yeah, possibly.
Hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting point.
I will lower my hand.
Hey, Mark, you've got a question.
Amy, John will know that one of these meetings doesn't pass too often without me throwing in a totally utopian suggestion. Sometimes he allows these utopian questions, sometimes he doesn't. It looks like I'm getting away with it tonight. So here goes. I look forward to reading that article that you posted in the chat. That's great. But that leads me on to think: is there anybody campaigning or thinking about transferring, let's say, for example, the U.S. military towards the control of the United Nations? Theoretically, then nobody needs to have a separate military anywhere else, and then therefore Costa Rica don't need to worry about their situation, and that becomes a sort of global police force that cuts down the amount of armaments that need to be produced and supplied to all these little mini armies all over the place. And we could actually reduce and phase out munitions on that basis. I would like it onto a United Nations with a world parliament. That's my hobby horse, which I'll put in there. But anybody's given that any thought? Anywhere have you heard that come up in any of your discussions, meetings, or?
I haven't. No, that doesn't mean that people aren't thinking about it. I guess my one concern I would have with that is just kind of also the kind of inequalities that are at the heart of the United Nations, including the Security Council, with like who has a veto and that kind of thing. So I guess we'd have to look at that. Actually, it's a little plug. Our next edition of the magazine is going to be about the UN and about some of the inequalities at the heart of the UN. So yeah, I think it's an interesting idea. I don't know if I would go for it, but it is an interesting idea. I guess it is a way of like trying to do things more for the global good as opposed to protect individual states.
There's no chance of it happening with the president of the United States the way it is at the minute. That would need to change, obviously. And I think there would need to be change at the UN end as well. There would need to be some sort of parliamentary control, and that's why a world parliament again fits well with me to solve that side of the problem. But it'd be interesting to see if somebody picks that idea up and thank you.
Yeah,
and of course, you know, there are in various places UN peacekeeping forces, so it's not as though it's an entirely kind of visionary idea. But I mean, there are places where that has happened.
Yeah, but again, I guess there has been quite some issues with those forces as well in various countries. So again, I guess it'd have to be reform at different ends. But
Barbara.
Just wanted to reinforce, Mark, you know, all the while there's a veto amongst the permanent 5 on the Security Council. That's not going to run. That if the General Assembly had charge of the UN, that would be a different matter. And I think that's what you maybe see as your sort of initial World Parliament idea. Now that would be a very different kettle of fish. In addition to the problem the current American president, but you know, basically the UN with its current veto structure is completely hamstrung. And you can't. It's so difficult. You can't change it because if you try to change it, then they'll veto it. So you can't change it. There are moves afoot within the UN, certainly within the UN association in this country, to try and tweak the charter. They can't. It would be a huge job to change the charter and have a new charter, but there are efforts afoot to try and to change it in some way, because everybody realizes that it's a totally unsatisfactory state of affairs. of course, part of the reason that we're in a lot of the binds that we are, because if the UN General Assembly has come up with some really good motions, for example, on Gaza, but it just goes to Security Council and one or other of the big five will shoot it down.
Yeah, that's actually one of the things that my colleagues can be talking about a lot in the magazine. It's like democratizing, or like kind of making the UN a more democratic organization.
Okay, any other comments or thoughts or questions that you have? Okay, Amy, is there one last thought that you want to give us before we finish the session formally? Is there one particular thought you want to leave us with on this whole issue?
I think just that although the kind of arms industry is so massive and international, that is almost like an opportunity for us, because it means that there are so many places that we can do something, and also so many people in different countries around the world that are doing things that we can all learn from each other. So I guess like I do still find hope in the amount of people that are trying to challenge the arms industry in some way.
Yeah. And I was the takeaway, particularly I have from what you said and what others have said, is actually the relatively small size of the arms industry compared to other aspects of British economy.
Yeah, exactly, especially here in the UK.
Yeah, and I wasn't as clear as I should be about that sort of size. So that brings up a lot of thoughts. So certainly for me, and it may be for others as well. So, Amy, thank you very much for talking to us this evening.
Thanks for
really
having me.
Interesting to listen to you, to share thoughts and experiences. A reminder once again, our next talk is a celebration of 10 years of Laudato Si, looking at economic justice. A month from now, Wednesday the 18th of June. Please do come along. Amy, thank you very much.